Hi, Manchester Youth. It is Nick Reinhardt's work. I am super stoked to be sharing with you your lesson for today about the history books in our Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. A really quick note, Christians tend to call it an Old Testament and a New Testament, when scholars tend to call it the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. We call it that because for Jewish people, our Old Testament is not an Old Testament, it is their Bible. So that's just kind of a more respectful way to talk about it, just so we know. So, what exactly are the history books? The history books are those books in the Old Testament or that Hebrew Bible that are not the Torah. The Torah are our first books that tell us the story of humanity, right? That Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those first five books, which tell the story of, the beginning of the world through the escape from Egypt and Moses leading the people into the wilderness and ultimately the people coming to the promised land. The history books are the next part of the story. They are what happens after the promised land is reached, before we get those fiery prophets at the end of the Hebrew Bible, kind of calling out the people. This space of the history books is where we make this transition of the people of Israel being slaves towards having enough power that the prophets have to come and kind of tell them a little bit about themselves. Now, some people think that talking about the history books is a little bit boring. This isn't something we talk about a lot at church. And I think part of why we think it's boring is because we're not always good at looking at the Bible as this multi-generational story. So I know it's not the way we normally do things, but I want to start our lesson with this kind of 5-minute history video, which sets up the story of the Hebrew Bible so we can kind of understand the context of what we're talking about here.
In the beginning, God created the universe and a planet called Earth. Humans were formed in God's image to continue God's work. But soon, humans decided we want to live our way, not God's. Selfishness and violence filled the world, so God started over with just one family. And God made a covenant with a man named Abraham. The land around you is now yours. Your family will be my blessing to the entire world. In just a few generations, they grew into a large nation named Israel. The Egyptians became fearful and forced the Israelites to be their slaves. Through a humble leader named Moses, God led the Israelites in a great exodus back toward their promised land. Along the journey, God gave laws and commands to help the Israelites follow God's ways. Finally, after 40 years of struggle and complaining in the desert, the Israelites arrived back home in the promised land. In victory, the people worshipped God, but soon after, they turned from God and lived their own rebellious ways. This became a pattern from generation to generation. Israel's greatest judge was Samuel. He followed God's ways and spoke for God as a prophet. He told Israel that God was the only king they ever needed. But they desired to be like the corrupt nations surrounding them and insisted, "We want a human king who we can see to rule over us just like the other nations." So Samuel found a man named Saul to be Israel's first king. His reign began well, but before long, Saul stopped following God's ways and made many bad decisions. So Samuel told Saul, "Because you have turned your back on God, God has rejected you as a king." Samuel's search for the next king led to a courageous young shepherd boy named David. When David grew up to be king, God blessed him and the Israelites greatly. But David was not perfect. He had an affair with a married woman and committed a murder to cover it up. But deep inside, David always loved God and would return to living in God's ways. Known as the poet warrior, he wrote music to God called psalms, heartfelt expressions of prayer, struggle, and thankfulness. After many years as king, David gave the throne to his son Solomon. God also told David, "One day, one of your descendants will rule with a kingdom that will never end." Solomon succeeded his father David, becoming the richest king in Israel's history. Full of God's wisdom, Solomon wrote books like Proverbs and built a magnificent temple, a permanent tabernacle reminding people of God's continual presence. But Solomon strayed from God, marrying corrupt wives who led him into worshiping false gods. Civil war broke out, dividing the country into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. Soon, both of these kingdoms were led by corrupt kings who ignored God's ways. During this time, prophets were sent as messengers, calling the Israelites to return to God. They warned of the destructive consequences ahead. The prophet Elijah, a wild and rugged man, showed up false prophets by calling on God to give an awesome display of fire. The prophet Elisha followed him, bringing a boy back to life by causing him to sneeze. These prophets challenged the Israelites and their kings to return to God's better ways. But the Israelites would not listen. Distracted in their own rebellion, other nations swept in and conquered both of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. God's people were forced out of the promised land, and many were taken away to be slaves once again. The temple was destroyed, and the people lost everything. This was a time called the exile, where many of the Israelites, now called Jews, were scattered across different lands. One prophet named Daniel was sent to a city named Babylon. The law demanded that everyone pray only to the king of Babylon, but Daniel refused and prayed to God 3 times a day. So Daniel was thrown into a pit of hungry lions. But God closed the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged the next morning without a scratch. Though scattered, God was still watching over the Jewish people, and God gave them hope, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah's words. I'll make a new covenant with the people of Israel, returning them to the promised land and filling their hearts and minds with my ways. 60 years later, this hope was realized. The Persian Empire freed the Jewish people to return to their promised land. A small number gathered back in the capital city of Jerusalem, and a new, smaller temple was built under the leadership of Ezra. Reunited, they celebrated and shouted with joy. But the elders wept in remembrance of what was lost. Prophets like Malachi and Isaiah pointed to the future and a coming king, a Messiah, one who would fully restore Israel and bring a new kingdom of peace. So the Jewish people waited and hoped, and God would not speak through the prophets again for 400 years.
That was obviously a very quick history that was moving through. But I think it's helpful for us when we're looking at the Bible stories to remember that they don't all live in isolation, it's all connected. Now, if you're like me and you were sitting down to read your Bible, we're used to reading Moses' story, this story of being enslaved and God leading his people to freedom. As I continue reading through my Bible and I hit on some of these history texts, I come with a very different story of what's going on, right? I think specifically of the book called Judges, in which we hear a lot of stories about Israel being in a position of power, right? As we saw in the video, these histories deal with Israel coming to terms of what it means to be a nation on this kind of political sphere when there are others. Where there used to be this focus of escaping earthly oppression for a focus on our divine call, as the people are in the promised land and build up their own kingdoms, we get this focus once again on earthly matters. In fact, the people know that they are called by the 10 commandments, by these 600 laws in Torah, to have God at the top of their priority pyramid, right? They know God is the head of their society. But once they start having a little power and looking at those around us, they say, oh no, this isn't good enough anymore. We don't just want our religious laws, we want political leaders like everyone else. And this story tells us that once the people move their focus away from God towards the politics of the world, things get really messy. In fact, the kingdom breaks apart. The people get to this promised land. We're supposed to have a kingdom together. And ultimately, this kingdom splits into two, right? We have leadership that includes both of these countries as one with David, and then ultimately it falls apart. So there's breaking into two kingdoms, which are named after these different tribes. We have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, right? So we are a community in the desert. We go into the promised land. We become our own country. We get involved in the squabbles of the world, and the country breaks apart. Some of us might be hearing how this can sound like some of our modern political contexts, right? And in fact, it's not just that the kingdom is split, but ultimately the temple is destroyed. The Babylonians come in, the Israelites are exiled. They lose the promise that had been laid before them. They lose this promise because of their inability to live up to the expectations which had been laid out for them. Torah is full of these rules of how our society is supposed to run, how I am supposed to interact with another individual. But we see over time, through this change in power, it can be really easy for us to forget those things, right? The people are comfortable and they forget the expectations of their God. Now, this is where it becomes interesting to me because it can be really easy to sit and look at these books and think that they don't have a lot to do with us, right? Why do I have to memorize the names of books in the Bible that I don't even hear the preacher talking about on Sunday? Well, to me, the reason why this history part is so important is because while the Torah tells us about God's movement among God's people, the histories kind of tell us about the movement of God's people and how they fail to live up to the expectations, right? The prophets come in to remind the people of the spirit of the law, of God's expectations on how we are to treat one another and how we are to care for those in our society. So, my question is, how do those commandments help us avoid the pitfalls that come with power? How can expectations and boundaries from God help us to avoid corruption, help us to limit the selfishness, help us to interrupt those times when we want to follow our own will to instead find the will of God? How can a story of liberation continue to be about God's love even once we are free?